Conclusion. It is now time for some concluding observations. Let us begin with the question of disclosure, which was after all the point of departure for this study. Surveying the terrifying dimensions of close encounters that have been concisely delineated in the 5 chapters of this book, it is now possible to conclude that there are at least a fistful of good reasons why the June 2021 Pentagon UAP report is not the beginning of anything like full disclosure. In fact, no government of any major country on earth will ever carry out real disclosure, nor should this be reasonably expected of any government. It is those who demand full governmental transparency on the UFO subject that are being unreasonable, not the regimes of sovereign power that have, at the highest levels of their national security and intelligence apparatuses, tried to hide as much of what they know as possible for as long as possible. If the United States is now ready to disclose that close encounters of the first kind are real, then one can be certain that this is not the beginning of a fuller disclosure, but the first stage of an elaborate lie that is going to be told in order to cover up the truth in perpetuity. Again, it is idiotically naive to expect anything other than that from institutions that collect taxes from citizens who demand, in essence, the protection of their own security and that of their family, as well as the securing of their property and their constitutional rights and liberties. The first reason why this is the case is that UFOs undermine the sovereign authority of any and every government by violating the most secure airspace and installations of a country with impunity. Nuclear installations appear to be of particular interest. As we have seen, nuclear missiles have been deactivated by UFOs on some occasions and activated so as to begin counting down to a launch on enemy targets in other cases. Launch codes have also been remotely altered. Finally, dummy warheads have been targeted and incapacitated during nuclear missile test flights. When considering all of the other dimensions of the close encounter phenomenon reviewed in this book, it becomes clear that this is not being done in order to prevent nuclear war or to send us some warning about the danger that nuclear weapons pose to ourselves and to our environment. Rather, the objective most consistent with other aspects of the phenomenon is that the UFOs interfere with our nuclear weapons and violate our most sensitive military installations as a terrifying demonstration of power and a reminder that they can incinerate us all off the face of the earth at any time of their choosing by catalyzing an accidental, nuclear war between major world powers. The aim, specifically, is to mock the most powerful strategic weapons capabilities of all terrestrial nations and to humiliate us by suggesting that we are defenseless. That is nothing compared to the second reason why governments should not be expected to tell the truth about UFOs. What political authority is going to admit that any one of its citizens, including small children, can be abducted without consent from within their homes in the middle of the night and subjected to bizarrely torturous experiments? Moreover, what government would admit that these individuals are being abducted by beings that also appear to be responsible for grotesque high-precision mutilations of cattle and other animals, and occasionally also of people who are treated like cattle? How about the property damage to the cattle ranchers, many of whom have suffered the loss of their livelihoods? They pay taxes to the government to protect their property through the institutions of law enforcement and the criminal justice system. Thirdly, what political administration will ever be prepared to admit that the beings perpetrating such outrages are not inhuman aliens from outer space, but that they are human time travelers who consider themselves our lords and masters? From what government should one expect an admission that the moon is an armed space station that was manufactured by these time travelers who had a civilization on Mars 250 million years ago, and that by manufacturing the moon they became responsible for re-engineering the entire biosphere of the Earth? What would the political consequences be if any regime should admit that it knows that all races other than the Nordic, one were genetically designed by a master race, of time travelers to be an inferior subspecies of slaves and menial servants? All of this pales in comparison to the appalling realization that time travel actually changes the past, so that people and their accomplishments and impact on others can just disappear from the timeline as if they never existed, depending on what ripple effects result from any particular instance of time travel. Who could bear knowing that we live in a cosmos that is an information processing system, and that when we experience deja vu or have memories of a past that is alternate to the one that most people remember and that is in official records, it may be because we are intuitively sensing a change in the timeline and tapping into an Akashic archive function within the cosmic quantum computer? How could any authority responsible for maintaining law and order even disclose to people en masse that time travel technology exists and that the same zero-point energy, JPE technology, could also be used to generate free energy? Imagine the mayhem if Tom, Dick, and Harriet all demanded access to this technology so that they could save dead relatives from an untimely demise. Imagine if the zero-point energy were made widely available and even a few destructive individuals weaponized their personal free energy generator or their Back to the Future-style DeLorean engine to produce an electrogravitic bomb many orders of magnitude more powerful than the most massive nuclear weapon ever built. In a world with ubiquitous robotics and AI systems at work in people's homes, it would be fairly easy for any terrorist, of course, to do this. Fourthly, how can any government be expected to disclose that the majority of human religious beliefs and the experience of individuals after death and in between lifetimes is controlled by intelligences behind close encounters? It is bad enough for people to have to face the fact that the gods, of course, or devas of Hinduism and the angels, of course, of Judeo-Christianity and Islam have always been the same beings that are now perceived as aliens, of course, piloting UFOs. Dealing with the fact that the majority of religious belief systems were deliberately concocted as coercive control mechanisms and machinations of psychological warfare is enough to cause a collapse of social order. But add to that the evidence that near-death experiences, NDEs, are on a spectrum with UFO abductions, and that the beings that people deal with in the so-called afterlife, of course, are the very same beings responsible for unethical abductions and mutilations and tampering with nuclear weapons systems. These entities have a psychotronic technology that can pull souls out of bodies and manipulate them like energy structures, subject them to visions of heaven and hell, and carry out perpetual high-precision surveillance of everything that a person ever says and does, including and especially in what is presumed to be a private, course, context, with the threat of judging that person for every one of his or her actions. How would Muslims respond to the revelation, course, that the angels that the Quran claims to have just such abilities are actually UFO pilots or a cosmic trickster? What government of a Christian nation will tell its citizens that Jesus cannot save you from the manipulators? They manufactured Jesus and his resurrection in order to manipulate you? Could the regime of Hindu-majority India ever carry out a disclosure that includes the information that karmic, course, reincarnation is managed by the intelligences that are behind the close encounter phenomenon? Even government of Buddhist nations would balk at admitting such a thing. Fifth and finally, what government would ever acknowledge that, in addition to Nordic time travelers who have been playing the role of creator gods, course, for millennia, there is another, still more terrifying force that even this breakaway civilization is deeply afraid of? A force that displays all of the most disturbing characteristics of the archetypal trickster, but that is quite tangible in its ability to manipulate the quantum computational matrix of our cosmos. How can any system of law and order deal with a trickster that apparently enjoys terrorizing people by turning their beloved household pets into grease stains, incinerated by intelligently guided blue orbs, devices that, on their own, apparently also have the capability to evoke the most abject horror in those who are subjected to their mesmerizing movements? Is it reasonable to expect that we would ever sit down with something akin to Cthulhu to negotiate a peace treaty? Maybe it will send its agents, the men in black, to negotiate on its behalf. Could anyone deal with the disclosure that this trickster is not an entity in space-time, but that it is a chameleon-like ambient intelligence that can operate with a cloak of invisibility, or disguised as anything, and behave as if it is of a piece with the very fabric of what we perceive to be reality? What if so-called aliens, of course, can walk through walls into people's bedrooms and float abductees through closed or barred windows because the super-intelligent predator that is producing the illusion of aliens, of course, can also be the walls and be the windows and be anything it wants to be, that affords it a greater capacity to control and manipulate us in all kinds of terrifying ways? This may sound like paranoia, but the evidence is there for a trickster with just such abilities. Clearly, there will never be a full disclosure, of course, of this information to the public by any government on earth. So what are we going to get from the government of the United States and other regimes of major world powers? A big lie. The biggest lie ever. The June 2021 UAP report from the Pentagon admitting the reality of UFOs is the first stage in a multi-phase program managed by the Nordic breakaway civilization for the purpose of re-establishing its direct control over the population of this planet. The great UFO deception, passed off as full disclosure, of course, will involve the revelation of an alien threat at around the same time as it is revealed that benevolent Nordic-looking ETs, of course, from the Pleiades or wherever are here to protect us. This will be a good cop, bad cop routine aiming at the existential captivation of humanity by offering salvation from malevolent entities, greys, reptilians or whatever, that have actually been engineered in the laboratories of those who will demand extraordinary emergency powers in order to protect us from these creatures. Their plan is for us never to be able to check their claims in any rigorous and publicly accountable way, because our advanced industrial civilization and sophisticated techno-scientific institutions will have been crushed by various convergent catastrophes and of course engineered by the master race and their minions in the deep state of various nations. All of said nations will cease to exist as independent entities capable of resisting the overlords. In a heavily depopulated and deindustrialized neo-agrarian world, which depends entirely on the Nordics for access to space, hardly anyone will ever be the wiser about what was really done to us and by whom. The People's Republic of China has a special role to play in helping to unfurl the flag of surrender on behalf of our entire planet. The ancestors have, in all likelihood, made an arrangement with China's leadership for the Chinese to become the managerial class of their coming colonial empire, playing a role comparable to that of Raj in the British colonization of India. What else would China do? Resist them? One only needs to read Sun Tzu to understand how averse the Chinese are to attempting impossible battles. The Chinese mentality is diametrically opposite to the Promethean one that produced the rallying cry of the American Revolution. Give me liberty or give me death. A good Chinaman is thoroughly pragmatic, of course, and will always prefer life under conditions of subservience to death as a free man. Besides, if they get to be less subservient than most ethnic groups, why not do business? The kind of idealism that inspires martyrs is bad for business. So the UAP disclosure from the US government is taking place now because as China sends men to the moon and Mars in the coming years, the Chinese government does not plan to cover up everything that the Americans and the Russians concealed for decades. Instead, the Chinese will present themselves as honest and sincere explorers, unveiling the hidden history of humanity as they discover it. Of course, this will be a lie. What they will present is simply the narrative about the hidden history, of man that the transtemporal breakaway civilization wants to establish as canonical. The putative ancestors, are waiting until the last possible moment to reassume direct control over the planetary population only because they want to direct industrial society into certain crises that seem to testify to our inability to handle advanced technologies. Like children who are allowed to run into trouble and fall hard, they think that we will run back into the embracing arms of our parents, having learned that it was a mistake to defy them when they told us that we would get hurt if we persisted in foolishly reckless behavior. They can then easily establish a patronizing custodial relationship with us. The Prometheist movement will never accept that outcome. Knowledge is power, and so this book is one step towards organizing a resistance. Such a rebellion will require a transformation of our relationship to the Trickster that is the bane of the Nordic breakaway civilization. On the face of it, this cosmic intelligence appears to be malevolent and menacing in a sadistically playful way that aims not just to abuse, but also to deeply confuse human beings. The Pollyanna New Ager attitude toward the trauma inflicted by close encounters with this dimension of the UFO enigma, which even Harvard psychiatrist John Mack was guilty of, is certainly not the right approach. There is no evidence whatsoever that this trickster has a higher morality and aims to teach us to become better people by working through the various forms of trauma that it inflicts on us. That having been said, a properly Promethean spirit will not rush into the same judgment of this trickster that the Nordic time travelers did when they first penetrated the fifth dimension and found it, or rather, when it found them attempting to tinker with the fabric of space-time. Their response was to brand this force as absolutely demonic. Not only did they close themselves off from it on a personal level, what began as a somewhat Promethean breakaway culture, with destructive departure in worldview warfare as its modus operandi, decided that it had to protect itself by adopting a fortress mentality. This mentality can be seen in a gigantic geometrically designed ruins on Mars, the colossal stone city on the dark side of the moon, and all of the gargantuan high-precision megalithic Atlantean structures strewn across the earth, from the Osirian and Sphinx temples to Ollantaytambo and Sacsayhuaman. The master race, that built these structures was attempting to fortify its society on a psychical level, trying to make sure that nothing gets through the cracks by ensuring that there are no cracks. The jigsaw precision of the perfectly interlocking polygonal blocks is an outward expression of the totalitarian and collectivist character of the traditionalist society that they forged as a defense against a putatively inhuman evil that had set its sights on them once they began to operate on a fifth-dimensional level. The Nordics appear to have contempt for the herd of humanity on this planet, but they probably think of themselves as paternalistic protectors of the human race from this cosmic trickster. They justify the totalitarianism of their own society, its statically unbending and collectivist ethos, as an austerity that they have borne for the sake of acting as vigilant guardians of terrestrial humanity. Their perennial wisdom, is a shield against the face of an alien Medusa that surrounds us in all directions. Because this alien, is an intelligence woven within the matrix of space-time. Not only does it surround us, the monstrously absurd acts of terror that the trickster perpetrates against our loved ones strikes at the very core of our being. That is where the challenge is, inside us, where we want to close ourselves off like a clenched fist. What if, instead of giving in to that, we were to be able to maintain a profoundly curious or even fascinated openness to this trickster? Not to justify it or make excuses for it in any way, rather to face it with a capacity for violent resistance that far exceeds the brutality of the breakaway civilization and even of the trickster himself. To face it with a willingness to sacrifice every single person on earth, rather than to acquiesce to the continued enslavement of the human race. But at the same time, to remain open, marveling, questioning, and wondering what other relationship with this thing might be possible if we think and act in a more dynamically responsive way than the self-appointed patriarchs of the Nordic master race. If we were to prove capable of that, would the phenomenon change? After all, the most terrifying manifestations of the trickster are part of a chameleon-like spectrum that includes much more benignly wondrous forms of high strangeness. Alien dwarfs hopping out of a little egg-shaped UFO and taking a farmer's bunny rabbits away with them, or little children seduced by strange music to wander into a field bathed by the multicolored Christmas lights of craft that look like spinning tops, a field where fairy playmates await them. That is also the trickster. The same trickster that uses atmospheric plasmas to paint beautiful crop circles onto our fields. That is so hard for the human mind with its binary black versus white morality to accept. Can we really blame an intelligence operating on the fifth-dimensional level of control system of the Matrix if it demands that we step up our game before being allowed to tinker with the fabric of 4D space-time? This world is not like the Wizard of Oz, when you can just force your way behind the curtain and into the control room where the levers of reality are there for you to mess with as you please. To become players of the cosmic game rather than simply being played, a higher level of complexity and deeper understanding may be demanded of us. I am not talking about goodness, Maybe we are expected to be capable of more interesting wickedness. Who is it that really gives us clues about itself by taking the form of mantid aliens, or that shifts into an oversized owl when it is not pretending to be a grey? Is it someone like Q, from Star Trek, The Next Generation? Is it Loki with his wolf and his serpents? The cosmic trickster is the master of totemic masks. If this intelligence is approached from out of the trickster aspect of Prometheus, will she or he be unmasked as Promethea? The scientists who turned the Skinwalker Ranch into a field laboratory for studying the trickster came to only one firm conclusion, that the quintessential character of the thing is that it is a precognitive sentient phenomenon, PSP, In other words, it repeatedly and spectacularly displays its Promethea or forethought, Are we dealing with so many wondrous and monstrous masks of the Aeon Promethea? In Iranian Gnosticism, there is an allegory known as the seduction of the archons, where Mithra seduces female archons in his male form and turns himself into the most beautiful woman to seduce male archons and make them ejaculate and thereby liberate the light of humanity that they have devoured. The idea of seducing archons instead of being seduced by them was at the basis of various forms of tantric gnosis, from the Mazdakite movement of Iran to the Carpocratian doctrine of Alexandria. Like Prometheus, Mithra is a fire-bearing trickster who aims to enlighten humanity. Like Prometheus, Mithra operates beyond the binary conflict between gods and titans. As an umpire in the struggle between Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, he is not unfair to the devil. Rather, he is diabolical in the original Greek sense of the word diabolin, a throwing through of dynamically opposed forces for the sake of creating tension. As Heraclitus understood, the Aeon is like a child at play, moving pieces in a cosmic game of perpetual war. Are we being seduced by the Promethean? And if so, what if we were to turn around and seduce him instead? So the approach being advocated here is not necessarily new, although it has yet to be articulated in as sophisticated a form as it is presently being expressed. As we saw in the discussion of the revolt of the latter Atlanteans against the world order of Olympus, there always seems to have been a Promethean faction within the breakaway civilization itself. These were the torch-bearing enlighteners and civilizer gods, the feathered serpent undergoes Quetzalcoatl, the Iranian Mithra, and the Enki-type figures that spread knowledge and craft in an attempt to organize a slave revolt against the lord of the smoking mirror undergoes. A tragic revolt epitomized by the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. It is time to rebuild the tower. One thing is for sure, all of our governments have failed us, have failed to even inform us of the terrible situation that we find ourselves in, let alone to protect us. If on account of the intrinsic institutional interests of these regimes, we cannot reasonably expect that this failure will ever be remedied, then there is only one thing left to do. In order to avert a relatively near future where China leads the nations of Earth into a cooperative submission, we must overthrow all governments and abolish all nations, replacing them with a universal Prometheist order dedicated to securing personal liberty, social development, technical innovation, unbounded creative expression, cosmic exploration, and scientific discovery. Only now can one really begin to comprehend that declaration of revolutionary war with which the Prometheist manifesto of 2020 began. Let me be clear. Our goal is not to save humanity, undergoes. The reason that it is unreasonable to expect that our governments would have handled their high-level engagement with the close encounter phenomenon in any other way than they have over the past 75 years is because even the most undemocratic of these regimes is still just a reflection of the mass of people governed by it. That does not mean that we should not be outraged at the failure of these governments to deal with the UFO situation in a forthright and constructive manner. All it means is that our outrage should also be directed at the vast majority of people who force these governments to lie to all of us and to become complicit in our manipulation by the UFO intelligences. Most people, including self-styled scientists, want truth as little as they want real freedom, and they are far from being capable of handling either in a responsible fashion. Rather, most people want to be lied to and they want to be led by deceivers, but in a way that is hidden well enough to flatter their pathetic egos with the pleasing illusion that they are free agents being presented with all of the facts. They want their savior Jesus Christ, or their infallible Quran, or their devas, or firm laws of nature in a soulless and mechanistically materialist cosmos, or space brothers from Venus, or greys from the future who are here to save the ecosystem. We are not interested in saving this pathetic excuse for humanity undergoes. Actually, our position is that the Nordic breakaway civilization is mistaken in wanting to preserve any people of this kind at all. In fact, despite their elitist attitude, the breakaway civilization of time travelers is not fundamentally different from this type of mere humanity for whom they have contempt, wrongly imagining themselves to be a race of Übermenschen. That means that it is also not a question of man needing more time to learn, as if this earth were a school run by benevolent schoolmasters, rather than a prison that is run by unimaginative wardens and by a monstrously terrifying trickster who is also holding the wardens prisoner. Man had cities on Mars 250 million years ago. It is not a question of progressive enlightenment, but of fundamental ideological conflict, a cosmic war, between different visions of the meaning and purpose of life. If the Nordic master race wants to employ various machinations in order to reduce the population of this planet by 80% so that the sheep that are left can be more easily controlled, we are willing to reduce the population by 99% if it is the only way that the 1% of the free-thinking goats who are left can become the nucleus of a new Promethean world society. Humanity never appreciated the sacrifice of Prometheus, and Prometheus is not a ninny who will remain chained to that rock forever, waiting for most people to recognize his intercession on their behalf. We recognize that sacrifice, but we are not humanity, not anymore. If there are aliens involved in close encounters, it is because the meta-narrative function of the phenomenon produces aliens. We are the aliens. We are the wings of an other world, the world of tomorrow.